William Wordsworth, known as the greatest nature poet of all time, really had very little interest in nature in and of itself. We don't see in his poems close attention to the movements of, say, water, air, light, simply because the poet takes pleasure in the movements. Wordsworth is constantly attaching meaning to movement. For Wordsworth, nature is most valuable when it is a reflection of his mind. He's very clear about this in any number of famous poems. So ultimately, Wordsworth is a moralist, seeing the natural world as a sort of inviting screen, if you will, on which he can project his human fears and desires, with the ultimate goal being transforming the facts of the natural world into moral lessons that encourage him and his readers to commune more actively with the natural world, which means to commune with the natural world as emotionally alive as possible. There are two examples of this that come to mind very quickly. One would be the poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, in which Wordsworth's speaker is interested in the daffodils dancing in the wind. They're beautiful and they call forth in him a strong emotional response. But ultimately, the daffodils are most important to him as markers of how his mind, through remembering these daffodils later, can conjure them and invite them to influence him in a moment of solitude and darkness. So the daffodils aren't so much engaging to him as flowers as they are markers of the powers of his mind, in particular his memory, to conjure something from the past to help him vitalize a present moment that feels dead. Another example of the way Wordsworth transforms fact into, say, moral would be the poem called Resolution and Independence, often called simply The Leech Gatherer. In this poem, as we know, Wordsworth sees the leech gatherer, certainly a part of the natural landscape, not a flower or a bird, but part of the natural landscape. And Wordsworth, the speaker in that poem transforms the leech gatherer into a symbol of fortitude that calls him out of a fit of despondency and gives him courage to face life with more cheer. I say this to introduce Dorothy Wordsworth's interest in motion, the motions of the natural world. She seems quite content in her journals, in particular. In her journals, either her Alfoxden journal, written during the time, uh, basically the summer of 1797, the summer of 1798, during which William, her brother, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were composing some of the great poems that made their way into lyrical ballads. And then later on, the early 1800s, when she and Wordsworth are settled in Grasmere in the Lake District. So she has a journal from Alfoxden time period and then a journal from her early days in Grasmere. It's just worth noting that even though her journal entries were not written for a larger audience, they were not written for publication. They were probably just written for her eyes and William's eyes. Even though Dorothy did not write in a traditional literary context of thinking about publication audience, her journal entries have great literary power. It's as if she were writing what we would now call prose poetry of a particular kind, a highly imagistic prose poetry. Uh, if we were reading a lot of early 20th century poetry, say the poetry of Ezra Pound, poetry of H.D., We would see a real interest in the image as image, the poet trying to capture the world as it is, without imposing meaning, without imposing morality onto the world. And the world in the poetry, say, of Ezra Pound or H.D., the motions, the circulations, the energies of nature are more engaging than the static points. So I would call Dorothy Wordsworth a poet of light and water and air. She is interested in objects. We have a lot of entries on flowers and, say, animals, trees. But she seems more interested in how air, water, and light flow through and around these objects. So in this regard, she takes pleasure in the motion of the natural world simply because the motion is pleasing and engaging to her. She doesn't seem to care what it means. Her eye, her subjectivity, her active mind, these are not intensely present in her entries. So even though she's writing about the same landscape as William, her prose provides a kind of counterpoint to his. It's almost as if William is looking at the natural world and saying, stay still. Daffodils, stay still and mean this to me, to help me find continuity and unity in my life. Leech together, stay still and mean something to me that will give me continuity and unity in my life. Whereas Dorothy will look at the same and say, wow, look at that motion, look at that energy, look at that flux, look at the subtlety, look at the nuance, look at the play, look at the flexibility, look at the plasticity. So this is Dorothy, the poet of circulation. And I'm going to give you an example of this by looking at the very first entry we have in her Alfoxden journal from 1798. And as I read it, I want you to listen for, again, her emphasis on motion. In this particular entry, the motion of water and the motion of light. There are other entries that are gorgeously devoted to air and wind and how it interacts with the water and light. But here we have mostly a focus on water and light. And just pay attention to how she's keen on the interaction between the flux, the flow of those two phenomena, water and light, and how they interact with the more static objects of what she's looking at. So as we know, Alfoxden, Wordsworth and his sister lived in Alfoxden, not too far from Coleridge and Nether Stowey, and these sites were located in the Quantock Hills, where the great poems of the lyrical ballads were composed. So here we have Alfoxden, 20th January, 1798. It's January. The green paths down the hillsides are channels for streams. The young wheat is streaked by silver lines of water running between the ridges. The sheep are gathered together on the slopes. After the wet, dark days, the country seems more populous. It peoples itself in the sunbeams. The garden, mimic of spring, is gay with flowers. The purple-starred hepatica spreads itself in the sun, and the clustering snowdrops put forth their white heads, at first upright, ribbed with green, and like a rosebud when completely opened, hanging their heads downwards, but slowly lengthening their slender stems. The slanting woods of an unvarying brown, showing the light through the thin network of their upper boughs. Upon the highest ridge of that round hill covered with planted oaks, the shafts of the trees show in the light like columns of a ruin. First, the water. She sees the hillsides, but she's most interested in how the water is making channels down the hillsides. It's as if the hillsides are not nouns for her. They're verbs. They're patterns of motion. And then the wheat itself is streaked by silver lines of water running between the ridges. That's so specific. The water running over the wheat And again, almost animating the wheat, making the wheat something alive, something moving. And in a similar vein, she sees the leaves of the trees, but does she focus on the leaves only? No, she sees them as a thin network of light. So we can imagine how light shines through leaves, and the leaves suddenly almost become bursts of a kind of flame. So the leaves themselves, like the hill, come to life and feel more like verbs than nouns. And the shafts of the trees themselves, the trunks of the trees themselves, in the light, look like the columns of a ruin. So here we see the light's transformative power, where it doesn't so much make the trees move, but transforms the trees into something grand, historical, uh, melancholy, yet beautiful at the same time. So this is a very typical passage, one of the most beautiful passages Dorothy wrote, and it's also worth noting how specific she is, how closely she's attuned to the minutiae of the natural world. If Wordsworth had seen this landscape, we might imagine him trying to find some symbolic value in the water or the light. But Dorothy does not analyze. She does not worry so much about interpreting. She is like a landscape painter doing sketches out in the natural world without really caring how these sketches will ultimately cohere into a painting. There's, as I said in another lecture, there's a real attention to what we might call isness in her journals. What is here right now, and what is moving, what is flowing right here, right now. For her, that is enough. Her writing feels like imagistic poetry, but it also feels sometimes like haiku. The haiku of Basho, the Japanese poet of the 16th century, who simply is trying to experience the natural world as the natural world without, again, projecting upon it human fears and desires. It's extremely difficult to see the world in this way. You have to sort of get your ego out of the way. You have to get your self-consciousness to quiet down a bit. But Dorothy does this remarkably. So as you go through her journals, do look closely for this emphasis on flux and stasis, this emphasis on the stark isness of the circulations of the natural world, and how they themselves can be just as beautiful as the machinations of the moralizing mind.